Welcome, I'm Giulia.
And I am Marta.
And this is LateMode, a podcast in search of the zeitgeist. Through a series of conversations, we explore the fragmented and hyper-connected modes of our current times. Hello there, and welcome to another episode of LateMode. It's Giulia here, and for this conversation, I sat down with Alexander Köppel, an artist, spatial designer, and musician currently based in Amsterdam. Alex's work fuses sound and space into sensorial experiences, conveyed through installations, sound production, and narrative elements. Fascinated by his modes of investigation, I invited him to discuss the topic of failure and perception. How do we create intention while leaving space for the imagination? Those topics brought us to reflect on how paying attention can help us care for ourselves and others. I hope you enjoy. Hello, Alex.
Hello.
All the way in the Netherlands, whilst I'm sitting in a hotel room in Wanganui, New Zealand. Pretty random way to start a podcast.
Very happy to be here. Well, digitally here.
Yes, also talking about perception, which I think is one of the topics you touch a lot in your work. I actually invited you because, we had a chat maybe 6 months ago whilst I was visiting a friend in the Netherlands, and I was really, I thought that your work fit this podcast. You were talking to me a lot about modes of perception, creating spaces that evoke certain modes. And I thought it'd be really nice to have you explaining to our listeners what this actually means to you. And I just want to introduce the topic that is guiding us today, failure. Fazal left it for us. So I have already prepared a few questions around this topic. But I would like to start by talking about your most recent work, which I think touches upon the topics you explore in your work. So maybe through this project, we can kind of introduce your interests and your work.
Yeah, you're talking about Finster, I assume. Yeah, Finster was an installation, a site-specific multi-sensorial scene as part of Uncloud Festival last year in Utrecht. And the festival took place in an old prison called Pieter Baan Centrum. So it's actually not just a prison, it's also an observation clinic for people who might suffer from a neurodivergency or psychosis or other forms of neural disorder or something, and who have within that committed a crime. So it would be a place where these people would stay for up to 2 years under observation to kind of assess whether or not their state had any influence or played any significant role in the crime they had committed. So basically, as a space or as a building, it identifies as a prison. And I followed an open call for this, and this was kind of mid-pandemic, so somewhere in 2020, I think. And I had this idea my first impulse was like to make a dark room and to play with notions of isolation versus freedom that somehow sometimes also come up in club culture. In the final work, this was not so much in the foreground, but maybe to explain a bit what I did actually, since people are listening. So imagine a small prison cell with a tiny entrance and a window, some furniture and a bed. And so what I did was I covered this entire cell in black fabric. With the help of bioplastic, kind of made it into a homogeneous surface. I gave the whole room a second skin, and I've created a sound piece and a fragrance. So it was an installation that would invite you to, meet this room in a way. It was almost dark, so I dimmed the lights down to just enough so that you would not be in pitch black, but that you could make out the contours of the space. And basically listen to the piece and kind of transition into a completely different atmosphere than the one in the corridor and that was going on in the rest of the festival.
Yeah, as I understand, a lot of your work revolves around creating, let's say, a scenery for a certain mode of attention. So a setting for encountering sound, but also, as I understand in this sound, as always a certain materiality to it too. So the space, the materials that you use within the space. And you're mostly interested in sound and listening as an embodied practice. So when you were creating this setting in this cell, what was it that you were actually hoping to achieve? Because to me, it sounds like it's almost creating a sort of discomfort or pushing for that.
Yeah, indeed. I don't know. For me, it was. I mean, I had a rough idea of how it was going to look or feel, and then when I started working in the space, I was there for around 10 days, making this textile. When the first stroke was up, and I could feel already some kind of effect on the space, I thought, oh wow, that's going to be intense. Mm-hmm. But it's indeed this kind of intensity and also bordering discomfort that I wanted to go for. I can't really say why.
You can't? Because I want to ask you why.
Yeah, so there's a few also, again, practical aspects. So one is, and that kind of, at least lately, comes up a lot in my work, is that darkness helps listening, because simply your visual sense is a bit reduced. There's not so much coming in, so your ears are more receptive. So it's a kind of classic fight or flight behavior, I would say. But for Finster, it was really about creating a sort of gloominess and this like monochromatic environment almost that does have something slightly scary maybe. But the question I was asking there also really was how you can, as a visitor, make that your own. So how can you overcome this notion of, oh, this is a bit harsh, maybe I don't want to be here. But what happens if you ask like, okay, no, but how can I engage with this space, and how can I listen to what's around me and smell how it smells and so on, in a way that it becomes a friend, maybe almost. Also, there was a kind of question of freedom as well. So because the darkroom in club culture is sort of the symbol for certain kind of freedom, or it makes for unforeseen encounters. And in Finster, I think it was a bit the encounter with a self. And then within this context of this prison, it obviously also spoke a bit in the direction of, how are you kind of free in your own mind that is sort of tricking you. But that is a notion that I hadn't foreseen, or something that was also out of feedback from visitors. It's a bit hard to put a finger on a very specific why is it intense.
Well, I mean, do you think that the fact that already this was a prison cell space, and you already have a sort of set of imaginary, I don't know, associations to it, and then playing around with that also, I imagine, through sound and smell, were you hoping to touch upon like something that would maybe transcend the space or build upon that space?
Yeah, transcend might be something. I think one of the goals also was to really make something that is a little alien in this hallway. So you have to imagine there's this quite long, wide, but not very high ceilings hallway, and then you have all the cells, and they're all very similar. Some of them are really identical. And the idea was to, in this very small space, it's maybe, I don't know, so somewhere around 6-7 square meters maybe, to create like something that's completely other, and that really is, it's like an entity that's occupying the space and that you're allowed to explore. So within all of this darkness, or creating this unknown in a way, was a thing for me.
I would like to relate this to this idea of reaching an understanding of what a listening experience is, or what it can be, or sort of research, or to encourage different modes of listenings, etc. And I have a question for you, because, right now we're talking about sound, and we're also talking about spaces, and sound we always think of as something so abstract, sort of something that we cannot really touch. But then in your work, you bring this materiality to it, whether it's through a space or through an actual material itself. And to me, this makes me relate sound almost to a surface. Yeah, exactly. A surface that lets you access a different realm almost, this sort of piercing through.
Beautiful.
And I was thinking about it today, like, how do we call this? Because obviously, after our immediate perception, which is very subjective, then there is the imagination. So we start, like, imagining things which are not related exactly to that specific material or that specific space, etc. And I wanted to relate this whole very long sentence to our topic of today, which is failure. Do we fail to access this? Is it maybe why we need to have like this kind of spaces that we're encouraged to access these sort of realms? Like, what do you think? Because I mean, you think about this a lot.
I wrote a thesis about something in that direction, where the kind of point was to say that listening can grant very wonderful, meaningful experiences if done right, in quotes. I think, I mean, I'm not in a position where I can say we don't do that. I can only speak for myself. Everyone has their own subjective individual experience and chooses to engage with sound in different ways. But I do think that in general, the attention we devote to sound on a more profound level. So anything outside, the headphone commute and the sports motivation and the concerts, like, could be more in my wish, maybe.
And why should it be more?
I mean, it's a very personal undertaking maybe, but I just had really amazing experiences in listening, both in concert settings, but also in more experiential or experimental formats. And it's true that, at least for me, if I'm really immersed in a piece and the circumstances kind of are correct, so there's not a crazy amount of disturbance, and you also can somehow be touched by what you hear instead of only perceiving it, again, only in quotes, then I think that this, what you say, this imagination can really get on fire and really bring you places. And it's not, I don't know, for me, it's a great way of experiencing sort of within yourself through something that is waves in air. I just find it very fascinating.
Mm-hmm. I have maybe a bit of a tricky question to follow up on this, because I know that I was reading, I believe, the abstract of your current research and at the Art and Science.
The academy is the KBK, the Royal Academy of Art in The Hague, and the conservatory. The department is called Art Science Interfaculty. It's complicated and vague, but it is a gorgeous place.
Nice. And there, I believe you're trying to, sort of explore this idea of, letting go of a certain intention. And I wonder, how do you put together this letting go with what we're just talking about, with this intentional creation of a space where you just said, if there's no disturbance, if the setting is right, and how do you see these two things kind of going together? It's
very tricky in the sense that I just had a conversation about this with my thesis coach this week, where she also mentioned you talk about leaving intention, but the scenes you create are extremely intended. So there's a huge paradox there, that's for sure. I think so. I wouldn't want to kind of set this thesis start in stone, because I'm still working on it, or I still have to work on it also a lot. But it's true. It's one kind of also fascination of mine to ask sort of what happens if you observe the fly on your arm that's annoying, and you suppress this first impulse of chasing it away, just as an image of how I mean this intention thing. So kind of asking, what happens if we let things happen to us instead of wanting to make happen for us.
Mm-hmm. Well, if you would relate this to the experience of sound, to the sort of, let's say, encounter of sonic experiences, how do you place this idea of not having intention to the way that we should approach maybe our sound experiences?
I think it's a bit of a self-experiment sometimes. I mean, in general, sound is always present, right? Unless you're hearing impaired or you're in an anechoic chamber. But even then, you hear your own body very presently, actually. It's a fantastic experience also. So I feel like that we can only but engage in listening in different ways. Yeah, so there's again this paradox that if you say, okay, I will stay with something sonic that is maybe uncomfortable or disrupting, it's also intended, right? So this is also what I wrote in this proposal, that even the most porous, well-meant, open act of attention is intended. So yeah, it's a bit of a tricky one. But I think in general, to maybe also simplify it a bit, I just sometimes wonder if it might not be interesting for us to listen to things or to meet sound in a way that can be surprising. So if you hear something on the streets and you don't really know that, you maybe you deviate your path for 5 minutes because someone plays an instrument out of the window, to make it an easy example. But even if you have a construction site that is annoying as hell and you try to kind of tune into it, and at some point you can maybe make out certain musicalities in how these pressure hammers operate or something. So, but that also is, once you accept this occurrence that maybe at first you would reject, and you kind of start to interact in a certain way, or to really hand yourself over almost in a metaphorical sense, you can become friends. And it does not always work. Like, sometimes it just stinks and you want to go, let's say.
Well, that's totally what I was going to say. And I sometimes I feel, you have these little moments of kind of feeling cheeky with yourself. Like you're listening to something, I don't know, like there was last month, I think I was in the car and there was this huge machine. I don't know what it's called, but I believe it's used to roll cement. And it made like such a interesting tune somehow. And I was like listening to it and I was really getting into it and really imagining like that I was almost underwater, like in this playful space. And then suddenly I like switch off and I'm like back in the car. And like just for this, fraction of a second, I was kind of transported somewhere else from this, I don't know, what you would consider maybe an annoying, disturbing sound or something. So I agree with you. And I think we should give sort of also a little surprise to our listeners. I would like to play maybe 4 or 5 minutes from one of your pieces, which maybe you should introduce.
Are we showing Marina's Prelude now? Yes, great. Maybe a word on that. That came out of a kind of very different direction than what we just spoke about. So it's a sound piece I made that was a contribution to the Sounding Nature project initiated by Cities and Memories. Cities and Memories is a guy in the UK who sends out a bunch of field recordings every now and then to all over the world for people to reimagine these sounds into new pieces. It's a beautiful project. It's very big by now, actually, I think. So, and I had I got a hydrophone recording from cracking ice in summer in the US, I think Chicago, some kind of bay. And I tried to relate this very crackly, static notion or sounds of ice to another state of water that we all know very well, which is waves. So maybe I leave it at that. And then after listening, we can comment a bit more.
Yeah, let's do it. Wow, that was a nice little break. I'm happy you created, or we created this space. Yeah, it's really that, right? What we're talking about, and you just kind of brought it to me. And then by me playing it in my room, I was kind of like, where am I now?
Yeah, I think, that's maybe really a bit where it's going, or what I'm trying, let's say. And it's interesting, I'm glad you say that, or that you relate it also to your room again, because this piece was really entirely a musical project or a composition. So this one doesn't have a space in that sense. But maybe to link back just a little bit to what we spoke about before. So I just also reread my text that I wrote here in the SoundCloud about it. And then there is the sentence that the tonal utterances of the ice reminded me of creatures of some sort calling out. So this is really also what I meant a bit with, what kind of qualities can you make out in different kinds of sounds that speak to the imaginary as well, and that perhaps hold something for you. But this is also, this something is a thing that everyone has to find themselves. I can always only invite.
Sure. Maybe it's interesting. I mean, maybe you can tell me if it's too much of a personal question, but I mean, we're talking about failure and talking about this act of creating spaces, in this case, also quite intentionally or maybe not. I mean, the case of this piece, for example, was maybe not so intentional to create something, but did you ever feel you have actually failed to create what you intended to in this respect? And if you did, did you let it go?
I mean, no, let's answer for. I think definitely there were projects where I thought, that didn't really work out the way I planned to, and sometimes I'm a bit unflexible in this, because I sometimes feel I'm a very structured person, and then if things don't really go that way, then sometimes it's hard for me to let it go or to deviate. But it's getting better, actually. I think the beauty in failure is that it always depends a lot on how you look at things, in a way, because every failure also sparks new opportunities and perspectives, right? So that's also always the question about how do we look at this failure, and also what were the goals or expectations that made it a failure. So if I think about it in terms of listening or encountering something, I don't know. My elementary school teacher was very vocal about that mistakes are necessary in order to learn. Though I think failure is a bit more than a mistake, but
because in some of your work, you also explore this idea of leaving behind expectations, which I think that sound aiding the imagination is also a way to, leave maybe behind certain expectations about, for example, what we just listened.
I think one interesting thing about expectation is also just like how much do we know upfront of like an event or an experience or an artwork or a show or whatever it is that we're going into. And we talk about this a lot in Art Science, like how do you prime your audience? How much do you involve your audience in what they're about to see? If it's some kind of a performative situation or a presentation of sound or music or something like that. I think that's there is a huge sort of tool actually as an artist to play with, and I'm trying to do that as well. As a note on how to manage expectations, you could say, or how to influence your audience in a way that is subtle, but that kind of then enhances something else that you're...
So to play around with their expectations or to play around with your expectations?
Maybe both, but I think with the audiences.
And that's kind of what you were saying to me in our first meeting, how you're also interested in the sort of dramaturgy, to the sort of reception of certain spaces, right? The script, like how people behave in certain spaces when they're prompted to be in a certain situation. And I think when it comes to what we have been talking about, perception and imagination and also failure, like sometimes I think to all of these concepts that we create around artworks, we impose some sort of meaning upon them. Does it sometimes fail us?
Yeah, this question of meaning is a good one in terms of failure. I think it depends a bit of the kind of work. It's funny because a classmate of mine is thinking exactly about this divide between how does something appeal and look and is experienced, and how much meaning do we try to put onto it or read into it or interpret in order to sort of validate it somehow. And because his work also is very much experiential in that sense, and he's asking exactly this thing, like, what's the meaning have to do with it in a way. And I think perhaps the one kind of failure that I see there maybe is that if you would stubbornly try to read a thing while you're not perceiving it with your body. And again, that depends very much on the artwork or the kind of work or experience. But I think if one would sort of deny their own capacities to, through the senses, experience a work because they're so focused on maybe what the artist wants to say or how this could be interpreted or how this could be read and what kind of value it therefore would have or not, then I think that's a failure. Maybe given the fact that the work has a very strong capacity to engage the senses. Let's put it that way. I think for a painting, that might be a bit of a harsh statement, what I just said. But for other formats, I think I would say there can be failure in that sense.
No, it made me think, of course, our listeners have not seen images also of the kind of work that you do, then to maybe relate it a little bit. Of course, we're talking about sound and immaterial sound, but you do play a lot with this also materiality of sound on materials in general, like objects, spaces, etc. So it does have this embodied feature to it. And yeah, it was basically my question was just, how did you become interested in it in the first place?
Towards sound specifically?
Mm-hmm.
Basically, I made music since I was very young. So music was always around. I started with xylophone and then I had piano lessons for 10 years. And I sang a lot in choirs. And then at some point I had a recorder so I could record my own little improvisations because I suck at music notation. And at some point my brother showed me Ableton Live. He did a workshop at the time and he was like, oh, this would be really interesting for you. And I was clueless about electronic music production at that point, to a certain extent. And then I thought, oh, wow, this just opens so many possibilities. So with this, like, autodidactically exploring Ableton and what it can do and also exploring recording things, it just became a growing interest. And then also linked to, discovering different kinds of music, going dancing a lot in this time. And then, I don't know, there was no particular, like, push that made me think, oh, I really want to do that. It came sort of out of a project I did when I studied interior architecture in Germany, where I made kind of a first sound installation with cardboard and contact microphones that I thought I just want to keep this as a part of what I'm doing and not just as a musical hobby in a way. So that there came the wish for it to be sort of in my professional life, in quotes, whatever that is. And then, I'm thinking about this a lot these days. What is professional and why do we need it and so on? But this conviction maybe for it, that this is really important, that happened at 4D Sound. So I remember when I arrived there, that was 2017. And I got shown around and then the person guiding me just opened the studio door just a little bit. And like there came a wave of sound came out, sort of poured over me. And I just had this feeling of, okay, I'm in the right place. This is a place I want to be in, like a sound place where this really is at the core of what's happening. So that was a moment where literally a door opened a little bit into this notion of listening and the deeper implications also within that as a practice.
Which are?
Oh, far-reaching, I think. I mean, you could take it all the way to health, but I'm not very versed in that or knowledgeable maybe. But I think in the end, and that's maybe also something that I haven't touched yet in my answers, it's a bit asking like, how do we care for each other and the entities that we encounter, be they sounding or smelling or touching us and so on. But it's, I mean, listening is listening to sound, but it's also listening to yourself and to others. So the listening understood as in conversation. And I think that just can go very far between humans and others, for sure, especially others.
Only the piece that we listened to just now, made me, as we mentioned, maybe some a little bit discomfort almost, but also reaching a little bit in, almost, this womb kind of feeling. I don't know, I really felt it inside my body and almost touching this like kind of deeper thing inside of you that you're like, oh, I don't know if I speak with that part of myself like every day. So I think that's one thing. And another thing, as you're saying, that made me think about this idea of precisely exposing yourself to things that you don't often encounter, and how do we care for each other. To me, it relates to how do we also deal with difference, for example, different experiences that we have of the same thing. I don't know if this is something that you also find in your exploration of this medium.
For sure. I find it super interesting how you can have one short sound piece and people will perceive it very differently. But that's the beauty of it, because then you have something to talk about, and it does not require any kind of experience in let's say the sound art world, or you don't have to be a composer. You just need ears and some attention, let's say, to put it like naively. But in that, it really has this ability to connect and to make people relate and to see other perspectives of the same thing. Yeah, I think that's beautiful. And I just had this experience a bit in a workshop I did in Belgium with Mint Park. It was a workshop on field recording and listening, and we presented the outcomes at the Traders Festival. It's a small festival for sound and sound art in Pelt. And our group was quite mixed. So we were 3 people from The Hague and then a group of Mediakunst students from Kask Academy in Ghent. And they were much younger than me, which made for some interesting observations. And then really also some of them had very little to almost no experience in sound or DAWs or recording. And they made really fantastic small little pieces and explorations. And it was never at any point in this week about like, oh, but that's not a good sound design, or that doesn't, or, you should do it like this or that because it will sound better. It was never about that. It was really always, so we had kind of exercises, and in the end of the day would sit together and listen through the pieces we would have made that day. And we had always stuff to talk about. And that was really a little insight that I thought listening has this capacity to reconnect almost on this new level, because you all heard the same thing. And then on the other extreme, now I just told you that I've been to the Spatial Festival in Monom in Funkhaus in Berlin, which is a 4D sound system and technology. And they had a 3-day festival that was bursting with outstanding artists and compositions. And also there you afterwards kind of come together and you share experiences. And some pieces really were incredibly intense.
As in emotional or
just really touching, or really just really well made and executed. And leaving people in this sort of, you have to land again afterwards. So it's also an intense spatial setting. So it's also what we spoke about, this dramaturgy, right? Like, what do you do after? How do you relate to people or behave? Or like, I find it almost sometimes disturbing if after a concert or a sound piece, someone immediately asks me, so did you like it? Because for me, it's not about this, and I might still like be half in it. So I think there should also be time given to this kind of like coming back or coming out of. You can also put it in a more classical realm when people just are like applauding, and the orchestra or whatever, or the performers, and the first people start to run for their coats, right? and flee the concert hall. So all of these things I find fascinating about listening, but especially this connectivity that can happen. Yeah.
I guess maybe because you have this interest, I don't know if this is something that you do at all, but you also observe how people react to everyday sounds more than how they react to a set space where they listen to.
I mean, it's not something I actively do as a kind of fixed line of research, but of course, sometimes you're in the academy building, for instance, and someone is making, there's some kind of noise that is a bit out of the ordinary, as in it's, the ears are not used to it because it doesn't occur so often in the soundscape of the academy that you are very accustomed to if you're a student there. So if something bangs or falls or squeezes or I don't know, and you might turn around, we're like, oh, what was this? Yeah, but of course there's a huge difference in, how to say this? Yeah, it's almost like inviting to say, okay, we have this, let's stay with the academy. We have this soundscape. You can choose at any moment to sort of let yourself into this deeper by listening more closely to it, or you can also really block yourself from it. It's also funny because I just presented a piece at the open day of the KBK, which played with that, where I layered about 10 recordings of different spaces of the academy on top of each other, leading up to this very wide, big, overwhelming cacophony of sounds that then gets cut. And what happens is over the 10 minutes, this is building and building and building, and then whoop, it kind of abruptly stops, and it throws the listener back also into the acoustics they're in. Mm-hmm. So this is an effect I also really enjoy working with, that this old thing of like, if you have the loud, it's only loud because you have the silent after or before. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's really the interesting thing about sound. That, I mean, I was just recording an episode with my friend Marius, and we were talking about humility in that episode and talking about noise and silence. It's like, okay, you only have noise because you have silence, or the other way around, and kind of going in this, circle of like, yeah, you can't have one without the other, but then it goes more into the sort of philosophical understanding of these concepts, right? Which I think it's also what we've been trying to discuss in this chat. And maybe you would like to sort of sum it up in a new topic for our next guest.
I've thought about sincerity. So as in being sincere, as kind of like a funny trajectory from, or a wild one actually, from failure to that. But we discussed earlier how I think that sort of not being sincere with your senses can be a failure in certain situations.
Nice. I find it interesting, as always, when I record any episode, of the beginning topic and then the end topic, from failure to sincerity. Because I guess to talk about failure, you need to be really sincere to yourself, right? Well, thank you. Thanks a lot for the time and for, waking up so early to talk about all this. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for staying with us until the end. If you want to dive deeper into the show, don't forget to check the podcast description for extra resources, contact information, and a sign-up form for our newsletter. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and until next time, take care.